Okay, so healthy eating. It's like
Yeah.
one of those things that feels like it should be simpler than it is, you know?
Totally.
Yeah.
It seems like every other week there's a new diet or a new superfood everyone's raving about.
Right. It gets overwhelming. So today
Mhm.
we're ditching all the noise and trying to get back to like the fundamentals with Borja Girón. He's this like digital marketing blogger from Spain, and he's got this really refreshing, practical take on healthy eating.
Yeah, I like how he really emphasizes like tuning into your body and not getting bogged down with restrictive diets and, all that. It's very approachable.
Exactly. And he's really upfront about not being like a certified nutritionist or anything. Like he's sharing what's worked for him and what he's found through, his research and personal experience. So it feels more relatable,
Yeah.
less intimidating for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Like he talks about this idea of like eating only when you're actually hungry, which
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I've definitely been guilty of, like eating lunch just because it was lunchtime,
Oh, yeah.
even if I wasn't even really that hungry, which is, when you think about it, kind of weird.
It is. And that's actually something Giron talks about a lot, ditching those like rigid eating schedules and really paying attention to your body's natural hunger cues.
It's so simple, but it's something most of us just like completely ignore.
Exactly. And it plays into that whole idea of like mindful eating, really being present during your meals, savoring your food, paying attention to when you actually start to feel full.
Which, let's be honest, is easier said than done these days.
Oh, absolutely.
Like we're constantly on the go, multitasking, scrolling through our phones while we eat.
It's true. But there's a ton of research now that suggests that mindful eating can have some pretty significant benefits, not just for like weight management, but for our mental and emotional well-being too.
Makes you wonder how much better we'd all feel if we just like slow down a bit.
Right.
So mindful eating check. Now, where Jerome really throws a curveball is with breakfast. He's like totally against sugary cereals and all that.
Yeah.
He says we should be starting our day with protein and healthy fats instead.
Which honestly makes a lot of sense when you think about it, right? Like when you start your day with a sugar rush, it usually ends up with an energy crash later on.
Makes sense.
But if you have something with protein and healthy fats, like maybe eggs with avocado or like a protein smoothie,
Yeah.
it helps to stabilize your blood sugar, which means more energy, you can focus better and you're less likely to like crave those sugary snacks throughout the morning.
He even suggests things like having a tortilla for breakfast, which I don't know if I'm quite there yet, but
It's definitely different.
yeah, it definitely challenges those like traditional breakfast ideas.
It does, but it makes sense, When you start your day with protein and healthy fats, it keeps you fuller for longer. So it's a much more, I don't know, sustainable way to start your day.
Yeah, I can see that. And speaking of challenging conventions, Giron also has some pretty specific thoughts on the order in which we should eat our food too. Okay, so we're already kind of shaking things up with this whole mindful eating thing and rethinking breakfast.
Right.
And then Jerome hits us with this like food order concept.
Yeah, it sounds a little strange at first.
It does.
But it's actually pretty fascinating when when you really consider how our bodies process different nutrients.
Okay, so break it down for me. How does this whole food order thing work?
So basically, Giron's big on starting with fiber.
Okay,
Then you move on to protein,
gotcha.
and you save the carbs for last.
So fiber first.
Yeah.
Then protein.
Yeah,
And carbs at the end.
exactly.
Okay, but like why? Why does the order even matter?
Well, it all comes down to like managing your blood sugar levels, right? And avoiding those energy spikes and crashes we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So when you start with fiber, it actually slows down digestion,
Oh, interesting.
which helps to prevent that like rapid surge in blood sugar when you eat.
So like if you were having, I don't know, like a salad,
Exactly.
that would be a good place to start.
Perfect example. So salad, veggies.
Yeah.
That's your fiber.
Gotcha.
Then you add your protein in that second phase,
Okay.
and that gives you that longer lasting energy. It keeps you feeling fuller for longer.
So then like your proteins would be like what? Like chicken, fish, tofu?
Beans, lentils, all those like plant-based proteins too.
Okay, gotcha.
And then by the time you get to those carbs, your body is much better equipped to handle them without, causing a huge spike in blood sugar.
Interesting. He even specifically talks about fruit, saying like even though it's natural sugar,
Right.
if you just eat like a whole bunch of fruit by itself,
Yeah, it's still good.
it can still mess with your blood sugar.
It can. It's easy to think of fruit as like a free pass because it's natural and it's healthy, but it's still important to be mindful of how much you're eating and when.
That's a really good point. Okay, so this food order strategy is definitely something I'm going to have to experiment with.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about processed foods because Giron does not hold back on this topic.
No, he does not. He's like really adamant about reducing our consumption of processed foods as much as possible.
Yeah, and especially those foods that have like a million ingredients on the label.
Yes, like those ingredient lists that you can barely even pronounce.
Right, it's like a chemistry experiment.
Exactly. And that's usually a sign that it's full of like artificial additives, preservatives, all that stuff.
Yeah, and he's not just like being a stickler for like clean eating or whatever.
No.
Like he actually connects the dots between the rise in chronic diseases and our like growing consumption of processed foods.
Right. And there's actually a lot of research now that shows that link, like
Right.
there's a strong correlation between eating a lot of processed foods and an increased risk of things like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, even some types of cancer.
That's kind of scary when you think about it.
It is.
Like we're bombarded with all this marketing that makes this stuff seem so appealing and convenient.
Right.
But the reality is it's like filled with things that our bodies just don't know what to do with.
And it's not just about what's in the food, it's also what's missing. Like processed foods tend to be really low in those essential nutrients, fiber, vitamins, minerals, all the stuff our bodies actually need to thrive.
Right. It's like the opposite of that food is medicine idea.
Exactly.
So it sounds like Giron's not saying processed foods are like completely off limits.
Right.
But he's definitely advocating for like a more mindful approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Choosing those whole unprocessed foods as much as possible, being more aware of the potential downsides of relying too heavily on those more processed options.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Which kind of naturally, I guess, brings us to food marketing.
Yes.
Because Giron, obviously, with his background, he knows this world really well.
Oh, yeah, he knows all the tricks of the trade. And he's like really good at pointing out all those tactics that food companies use to make us think their products are healthier than they actually are.
Like all those like sugar-free claims and stuff that can be really misleading.
Oh, totally. I mean, just because something says sugar-free on the label
Right.
doesn't mean that it's automatically good for you, right?
Right.
Like, they often just replace the sugar with artificial sweeteners.
Right.
And those come with their own whole set of concerns.
Exactly. Or like those low-fat products that are just like loaded with sugar to make up for the lack of flavor.
Exactly. And Giron even talks about how fat in itself isn't necessarily bad, right? Like it's the combination of fat and sugar.
The dynamic duo.
Yes, which is so common in a lot of these processed foods. That's really problematic.
It's like they're playing like a nutritional shell game with us. Like you try to avoid one bad thing and they just like replace it with another.
Totally. And that's why Giron's so big on like becoming informed consumers, like actually taking the time to read those labels. Don't just believe everything you see in a catchy slogan.
It's like you need a PhD in food science just to like buy a box of crackers.
Right. And it's not even just about the labels. Like we're constantly being bombarded with messages about the latest and greatest.
Oh, totally. Like superfoods and miracle weight loss teas and all that.
Exactly. It's easy to get caught up in the hype and think you need to like revamp your entire pantry with all these exotic ingredients to be healthy.
Right. And it's like, where am I even going to find this stuff? And is it going to expire before I can even use it all?
Seriously. And that's actually the opposite of what Giron's all about. He's all about like keeping things simple, sustainable,
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
And speaking of things that can get, I guess, a little unsustainable.
Yeah.
Giron has some pretty interesting things to say about caffeine.
Oh, yeah. He does not shy away from that topic. He even goes so far as to compare, like, caffeine addiction to, get this, Coca-Cola's history with cocaine.
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty bold comparison.
It is. It is.
But, I mean, when you really think about it, like, how many of us are, like, completely reliant on that morning coffee just to, like, function?
Right.
Yeah.
And there's actually, like, a scientific reason for that. Like, caffeine really does have an effect on our brain chemistry,
Yeah.
right? It stimulates the central nervous system, and over time, our bodies can actually become, like, physically dependent on it.
That explains those, like, withdrawal headaches people get
Exactly.
if they skip their coffee.
Totally. So while caffeine in moderation is probably fine for most people, it's just something to be mindful of, right? Like, how much are you relying on it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about mindful eating, rethinking breakfast, that whole food order concept, ditching processed foods, navigating food marketing, and even like caffeine's hold on us. What would you say is like the biggest takeaway from all of this?
I think for me, Giron's most important message is that there's no one size fits all approach to healthy eating.
Right.
He talks about this idea of bioindividuality, which basically means that we're all different. We have different genetics, lifestyles, our gut bacteria is different.
Wow, really?
Yeah, and all of those things can affect how our bodies respond to different foods.
So like what works for one person might not work for someone else at all.
Exactly. So it's really about finding what works best for you.
So how do you do that? Like how do you figure out what works for you personally?
It takes a little bit of listening to your body, paying attention to those subtle cues. Like, do you feel more energized after a protein-rich breakfast? Or do certain foods make you feel sluggish or bloated?
It's like you have to become a detective of your own like digestive system.
Yes, exactly. And it's a journey, not a race. Don't feel like you need to overhaul your entire diet overnight. Giron's all about making gradual changes. Experiment a little, see what works, and go from there.
So instead of getting caught up in these like rigid diet rules, it's more about just making conscious choices that support your overall well-being, both physically and mentally.
Exactly. Finding that sustainable way of eating that nourishes your body and your mind.
Well said. So, listeners, as you're going about your day-to-day, think about this. What's one small tweak you could make to your eating habits based on what we've talked about? Maybe you want to try a different breakfast. Or maybe you're going to start really looking at those food labels and like questioning some of those marketing claims. Remember, even small changes can make a big difference over time. And the more you pay attention to how different foods make you feel, the more empowered you'll be to make choices that really support your health and happiness. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into healthy eating simplified. We hope you found it insightful and, most importantly, motivating. Until next time.